It's Friday night with Byline Times. I'm Peter Jukes.
And I'm Hardeep Matharu, and over the next hour we'll bring you what the papers don't say.
And what the TV doesn't tell you. So coming up tonight, we'll be looking at our main subject, which is, do we, in light of all these allegations of cronyism, have a corrupted state? And what can we do about it? To follow that through, I'll be talking to Peter Geoghegan from Open Democracy about the amazing investigations he's been doing.
And Brian Cathcart, a journalism professor and co-founder of the campaigning group Hacked Off, will be joining us in the studio to investigate whether inquiries can actually hold governments to account.
But of course, we're not funded by hedge funds in Dubai, or by the license fee, or by advertising. We're funded only by you. You are the viewers. You are our mini Murdochs. And so help us out to continue what we're doing by subscribing to our Patreon account. That's patreon.com/Byline TV, patreon.com/Byline TV. And if you sign up, you can join us for a very secret after dark conversation when this program's finished with myself, Hardeep, and Brian Cathcart.
Well, Brian, gosh, Peter, forgotten who I'm with. Peter, it's been a very big and busy Newsweek here in the UK, but there's also been lots of developments across the world as well that we shouldn't forget. We shouldn't.
That Joe Biden, President of the United States, has announced troop withdrawals from Afghanistan on a significant date, September the 11th, 2021. Now, you're probably too young to remember. I remember when they first went into Afghanistan 20 years ago. It was supposed to be a policing operation, which personally, by the way, I supported. But always with a military intervention, it's easy getting in, it's difficult getting out. Yeah. The other thing that came up, you've seen that unfortunately Marine Le Pen and her formerly, I forget what they call it now, Front National, rising in the polls in France.
Again in France, yeah.
Which is worrying and maybe explains why Macron, the current president, is, I think, making some sort of Islamophobic noises. The other thing, which particularly interests me, of course, is Russian intervention in the Trump election, and I would say in Brexit, and announcement of sanctions. Particularly interesting as a character called Konstantin Kilimnik, who worked with Paul Manafort, who was Trump's campaign manager, and handed data, well, Manafort handed data to him, and it turns out that high level certainty, he was an FSB, which is the Secret Service, not the external Secret Service, the MI6 of the Kremlin. And that data looks like it might have been processed by Cambridge Analytica. All very down in the weeds, but we'll be reporting more on that.
Yes, but the big story, of course, this week in the UK has been these allegations of cronyism, which have engulfed not just the government, but also the former Prime Minister David Cameron. It's also the subject of this week's Byline Times' digital front page, with the headline, "When did the rot set in?" Peter.
Yes, well, I mean, I suppose there's a photograph of David Cameron with Boris Johnson and these allegations about lobbying around this company, which want a banking company, a financial company, isn't it, Greensill?
Yeah, so it's this financial services company, Greensill Capital. David Cameron became an advisor to the company in 2018, so 2 years after he left office, of course, following the EU referendum. And during the coronavirus crisis, he has been engaged in lobbying some very high-profile ministers, including the Chancellor and the Health and Social Care Secretary, over whether this company could be granted some emergency COVID-19 loans. The government didn't actually change its position with regards to Greensill as a result of any of the interventions David Cameron made, but he was sending text messages to, not just civil servants, but, as I said, ministers, on personal phones, and on more than one occasion this was going on. So in response, Boris Johnson has said an inquiry will now be held into this.
An inquiry?
An inquiry. The person overseeing this is a man called Nigel Boardman, who's a lawyer at a law firm called Slaughter and May. Curiously, a law firm which did some work during Cameron's administration, when he tried to change some of the lobbying regulations. This law company actually was challenging that. So there are already kind of concerns around how robust is this inquiry really going to be. But as you can see from the digital front page, we've raised the issue as to whether Cameron may be a worthy, but nevertheless convenient scapegoat, because
given all the other questions about conflicts of interest
Absolutely.
of the Johnson administration, and they were
yeah.
famous rivals. And so he's quite a good fall guy, isn't he? For
is.
the other questions circling around.
Yeah, because over the past 6 months, Byline Times, together with the citizens, has uncovered that £3 billion in public contracts during the COVID crisis have gone to companies that have links to either people who have donated money to the Conservative Party or associates who sort of support the party. And, you know, there's notions that the independent spending watchdog said that it was very strange that a VIP lane had been opened up by the government to give contracts to sort of preferred companies.
And these were non-compete contracts. That's me.
Yeah.
Under the pandemic, they were not put out to tender.
They
were
weren't
just
put
given.
out to tender.
Yeah,
There was a lack of transparency around this. International media, such as the New York Times, have raised, you know, allegations about corruption and cronyism in Britain following Byline Times' lead. And then we also have other stories knocking around, which we'll look at later, about claims made by Jennifer Arcuri. So it's really curious that all of this, and the government announced an inquiry into the former Prime Minister, David Cameron.
Before we go to Peter Geoghegan and also hear a bit from Dawn Butler, it does remind me, and maybe we'll talk with Brian about this, because we are slightly older men that do remember these things, of the summer of Sleaze.
Older men remember Sleaze.
Well, it's 20...
I'm shocked, Peter.
28 years ago. Yeah, 1993, 94. And actually worked with I met one of the journalists who writes for Byline Times, David Henke, the Cash for Questions scandal. And that was seen as very detrimental to John Major's government, and sort of got the reputation for sleaze. And many people, including the leader of opposition, Keir Starmer, has called it, you know, a sort of sleaze moment. But
the return of sleaze, you know, it never went away as such.
It never went away. It's come back now. The Tories have just dropped their nice image. So we'll be looking a bit more at that and talking to Peter Geoghegan imminently about his investigations. But just a moment before we do, it's just nice to see our work get into the mainstream. And here's Dawn Butler MP, who actually gave us a bit of a nod and wink and raised our investigations on Robert Peston's primetime TV show.
This is sleaze to the nth degree. The government knows it's wrong. Cameron knows he's done wrong. You know, the reason why I think a lot of public are not sort of picking up on it, because it's not being spoken about as much as it should, because the company went bust. Robert, the company went bust. That is huge. I mean, we know we've got the, you know, Byline Times exposed all the scandal of the PPEs. I mean, this is where it leads to. This is public money going astray.
Peter, thanks for joining us all the way from Edinburgh. You look suitably still a bit in lockdown to me with that beard and hair.
Yes, well, Glasgow actually, but it's not much different. And yes, we're very much, today's the first day we're allowed to leave our local authority, and I haven't even left the local authority. So maybe I've got the post-lockdown syndrome where I don't want to leave the authority.
But while, despite lockdown, and we'll talk in a moment later where you spent the last year, but you've been doing amazing work with Open Democracy, one of our fellow independent media organisations, in exposing so many issues, from Palantir to crony contracts and now furlough payments. People are getting very despairing about all this, and, you know, going around saying, oh, it's a corrupt country, cronyism. Can you explain, give them some light and some encouragement, and tell us what you did, how you managed to expose these things, maybe some of the legal challenges you brought, and give people a little bit of hope, particularly about the role of investigative journalism?
Well, I guess in some ways, you know, I'm always quite a hopeful character, but I try not to be too Panglossian about things. But, you know, I think there's a lot of hope. Like, even if you look at the role of investigative journalism, this is why we're talking about Greensell Capital. It's why we're talking about David Cameron. It's why we're talking about corruption. You know, this, for the last couple of weeks, I've felt a bit like one of those, you know, a fan of an indie band, and the band that you love has gone mainstream. You know, I talk about all the time, and now it's on the 10 o'clock news. So if that's not going to give us all a bit of a pep and a bit of a spring in our step, I don't know what will. So I've been very heartened to see revelations dominating, you know, the kind of phone-in programs, the Today programs that, to be honest, as you know, Peter, I've tended to avoid a lot of the stories that people like Open Democracy and Byline Times have been covering in terms of COVID contracting and all the rest of it. So I think it's really good. And the kind of work that we've been doing for a long time at Open Democracy, I think has been it started off talking about Greensill Capital in Cameron, but now we're talking more generally about Sleazy and the Conservative government. And I think that's all to the good. I think it's great to see people actually asking difficult questions, asking questions about what's going on. So I've been kind of heartened by it.
Well, you do look like an indie band that's gone mainstream with your beard, but I think it's a great analogy that actually everybody is talking about. Do you sense that in the street? I mean, I certainly do, that people that it's beginning to stick, or rather it's reached such a level that it can't be ignored by mainstream and it can't be ignored by the public.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think we've now, we've reached a point where people are talking about, the machinations of government in a way that I don't think they had before. We're talking about conflicts of interest, terms like that. We're talking about, we just had the story the last couple of days about, Matt Hancock owning shares in his sister's company that provides health procurement to the NHS and has won contracts. This kind of stuff, which, to be frank, for someone like me who's been writing about this stuff for quite a while, I brought my book out last year about all this sort of stuff. And at times it feels like, you're kind of slightly banging your head against the wall. We think about Britain, it's the kind of words even we use, words like, we don't really want to use words like corruption, cronyism, clientelism. And I think finally people across the piece are starting to ask that. So I think that's been very heartening for someone like me who's been kind of banging away at this coalface for quite a while.
And it's good to talk about your book. Do remind people of the title and who published it, because in a way, and I talked to you a bit about the book, didn't I, at the time, what we noticed through the Brexit debate, whether you're for or against Brexit, was that there was a cash funnel of think tanks allied to certain companies sometimes. But though they were free market think tanks, this was anything but free market. It was a kind of a closed market, more like oligarchy was replacing the classic free market. Was that a fair analysis? Is that what you think you've witnessed over the last 4 or 5 years?
Well, it's been very interesting. My book is called Democracy for Sale, Dark Money and Dirty Politics, out from Head of Zeus last year, and all good book stockist. Look at that for a plug. But no, I think, my book really does. It starts with the Brexit referendum and it charts that whole story, the story of which, the role of money in our politics. I think that's exactly the root of what we're talking about, whether it's lobbying or it's the kind of people that you're talking about, anonymously funded think tanks, which, quite interestingly, think tanks that, which would consider themselves libertarian think tanks like the Institute of Economic Affairs, who've got really great connections with the government. Many government ministers, including the current Chancellor Rishi Sunak, would be kind of acolytes of them. When Boris Johnson got into power and at his first reshuffle, the Institute of Economic Affairs sent an email to all its supporters saying that it had, I think, 21 people around the cabinet table had kind of affiliated themselves to them. And the Institute of Economic Affairs, interestingly enough, is a charity, and it doesn't have, even though is able to lobby government ministers, it doesn't have to register as a lobbyist under the terms of David appalling 2014 Lobbying Act, which is just how bad the Lobbying Act is. Well, so it's all incredibly circular.
And also, have we noticed either the Institute of Economic Affairs always pushing against sort of over government intervention, choosing winners, or the Adam Smith Institute, or the other sort of libertarian think tanks? Have we seen them criticize the fact that we've traced 1 billion of these non-compete contracts going to Conservative Party donors, another 2 billion to associates? Have you seen any criticism of that fact from any of them?
Well, it's interesting. You ask some of my techniques, and I've got many techniques, which you might talk about, like freedom of information, sources. I'm also always trying to cultivate sources across anywhere that could be potentially interesting. I do a lot of finding public documents. But one of the other techniques I have is, I do this so you don't have to, is I sign up for all of the newsletters for all these organizations.
Brilliant.
I include the Taxpayers Alliance. I do read their newsletter. And I can't remember what day it was, but it was one week when we'd broken another story about COVID cronyism. I think kind of in the middle of the summer, maybe around the time we did the story about Public First, a lobbying company, again, connected to Dominic Cummings, again, getting government contracts without any tendering. Okay. And I'd done that story, and I kind of was looking at the Taxpayers Alliance, and at the time they had the big story about how much universities were paying for, to cut for gardening, how much cutting of hedgerows in various universities. And it has been actually really, really interesting. I do occasionally troll them and ask, have you made any comments on this? So it does seem to be the way it's, some taxpayers' money is more important than others, it might suggest.
Yes, they're very concerned recently, I noticed, with the licence fee and not these billions of pounds in contracts. Now, just talk to us a little bit more about FOIs, for the audience who doesn't understand what you're doing there, and how this led to a legal challenge, which you kind of won along with the the law firm, which is just around the corner in our offices, actually called Foxglove. Maybe you could explain these moments of triumph beyond actually getting it in the mainstream.
Yeah, well, that's part of the job of our work at Open Democracy is to reveal these stories and to get them into public debate, get them into the mainstream media, get people talking about them. But also, we're trying to affect change as well as part of as part of our ethos to try and affect positive change. And freedom of information, FOI, is something I've been working with for a long time. If you ask anybody who's a journalist like me who uses FOI a lot, they'll say to you, the system isn't working. And what we've started doing is, how it works is you put in how it's supposed to work is you send in a freedom of information request, 20 days, you say what you want, and 20 days later the information comes back. If only it was like that. Especially central government has got worse and worse when it comes to FOI responses. The Cabinet Office is actually the department that's in charge of FOI, and it's the worst department for responding. It takes months and months and months, and sometimes you might never even get a response, never mind any information from it. And almost out of frustration with that, we've started taking challenges with FOI. So basically, the ultimate arbiter of FOI is the courts. There's an information regulator called the Information Commissioner's Office, and you can appeal to the Information Commissioner's Office if you don't like a judgment, but ultimately you can take it to what's called an information tribunal. And that's what we've started doing more and more at Open Democracy. And the first time we did it very successfully was with, do you remember the European Research Group, the ERG, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Steve Baker? Well, we asked back in, it must have been 3 years ago or 4 years ago, we asked the Department for Exiting the European Union, God rest its soul, could we have the kind of communications about the ERG? They said we couldn't have them because of divulge who was a member. And we said, this is crazy. This is a taxpayer-funded group that's really influential of parliamentarians. Why can't we have this information? 2 years later, we won an information tribunal battle. It took 2 full years, and we got the details, and we were able to publish it. And this has been an on-running kind of saga. We have another information tribunal case coming up against the Cabinet Office over its clearinghouse, which basically vets requests. We've discovered that there's a clearinghouse that operates in the Cabinet Office, which vets requests from journalists and campaigners. So if you're a journalist or campaigner, they know your name, they will kind of advise departments on how to deal with it. And we've seen that it's leading to even more rejections if you are a journalist or a campaigner. Not just to us, it's happened to us. We know this because we sent in things called subject access requests, so we could see how the government was talking about us. And anyone can do this. It's one of the things I'm really keen about with Open Democracy. We talk about how citizens can use these tools. FOI, subject access requests, they're open to everyone. And then I'm sure some of your viewers as well might have seen recently we had a very big win against Palantir, the kind of firm, the CIA-backed data firm. And we were working with your close colleagues. I hadn't realised they're in the same building with you, Foxglove, who were fantastic, Corey Crowder's remarkable law firm. And what we did is, again, we had to end up taking, basically we had a lawsuit. This time the government caved in at the 11th hour, and they commissioned not to extend Palantir's contract beyond COVID without further consulting the public. And we've kind of, what we're seeing with this and trying to show with this is that there is avenues, there is ways in which journalism can affect change, and the work that we do can affect real change. And FOI, I think, is a really important one because, the lobbying scandal that we're seeing at the moment, and Chris Cook made this point really well in Tortoise the other day, if we had effective FOI, we would be able to find out so much of these things that we're now talking about needing laws and regulations around. And the government itself is hiding behind it. We've seen actually that said that they couldn't divulge these text messages between Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, and David Cameron because they weren't covered by FOI. That's just not true. If Rishi Sunak, as Chancellor, is having a discussion with a lobbyist, which is what David Cameron is, that doesn't matter if they are writing those messages to each other on beer mats and passing them across the pub. That is still FOI-able.
Yeah, because it's government activity, official activity, and of course, and paid for us. This is the whole point, isn't it? That this is our taxpayer money. And that's why you have freedom of information. Apparently, Blair rather regretted that decision. So this is just brilliant work that you've done. And I'd urge everybody, you have a piece up today. Hopefully you can link to it on the screen on Open Democracy. Remind us what your piece up today is.
Well, we've been covering quite a lot of the lobbying scandal. So we've been looking at various aspects of what's going on with that, and particularly looking at the regulators, because it's something we often do. Is like, who's guarding these people? Yeah. Who's in charge of this? So Eric Pickles, the former corruption czar for David Cameron, former local government minister, turned sleaze buster, if you're to believe all the headlines yesterday. Well, it turns out that he's still the president of a thing called the Enterprise Forum, which literally exists to connect business and the Conservative Party, which you would think, is that not a bit of a conflict of interest from being the head of a lobbying watchdog? But also, when he went for the job, he did tell them in the interview, and he put it in his register of interest, but when he was asked at a parliamentary hearing in a written submission, do you have any potential conflict of interest, he answered no, and he didn't include it in the CV either.
So he didn't disclose that. So
no,
this is so two problems: conflict of interest, and also what I worked on this in 25 years ago, the revolving door problem. Civil servants, ministers going out and in from private corporations to quite soon after government. Well, this is, I'm sure there's going to be more of this, as the leader of the opposition has noticed. But before we leave, you say you must come back, and when come into the studio, come down from Glasgow, we'll see you face to face. But while we've got you there, you spent most of the last year, didn't you, in Ireland? And I just wondered, that's the article you've written today, about, before we forget it, just to diverge slightly, but it's very, very important, what's happening in Northern Ireland, with the border now apparently in the Irish Sea, and communal tensions rising again between people.
Yeah, I wrote a piece today for Politico. Yeah, sorry, I forget how many things I've written, actually. Yes, I wrote a piece for Politico Europe today talking about some of the tensions we've seen in Northern Ireland and actually across the Union. And the argument I'm making is that, I think it's called something, is sovereignty breaking up the United Kingdom. And, basically what you've got is a government in Westminster, Boris Johnson, is talking about sovereignty, the parliamentary sovereignty, taking back control to Westminster and actually taking back control to Whitehall. And I argue that that's really, really antithetical to the Good Friday Agreement, which is really based on an idea of conditional sovereignty. It gives Dublin a role in Northern Irish affairs, and ultimately it says the people of Northern Ireland get to decide their destiny, but also of Scotland. We're seeing more and more a very muscular, belligerent form of unionism that says we can't have a referendum here on independence because Boris Johnson doesn't want to have one. And that's really dangerous. Just this week, actually, the United Kingdom government said it's going to go to court to stop the Scottish Parliament, which has tried to ratify the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Children. Yep. That's a really, I think this is basically because it's a power fight, because they're saying we have control over this, we have ultimate control. And I think this is really dangerous, because the reason this matters is I think it plays well in England. It plays well amongst would-be Tory voters. There's nothing to be lost by kicking the paddies and kicking the jocks if you are Boris Johnson. But it has a really dangerous, we're seeing in Northern Ireland how dangerous that language can be. People in Northern Ireland, particularly Protestants, loyalists who voted for Brexit, and they voted a lot for Brexit, they were promised that they'd get to take back control before. And there's an echo of a very bygone era in Northern Ireland where it was a one-party Stormont state ruled by unionists. And for some people, that's very attractive. That was never going to happen. They're left feeling angry. They're continually being told that their power is going to come back to them. It's not. And instead of really kind of a proper union in which sovereignty is shared and there's some sense of compromise and there's divergences allowed, we're seeing this kind of pull back to the centre, which I think is going to only inflame tensions more. But I fear that many government ministers in London don't really care. And actually, I think a lot of Conservative commentators in London, I think, have been they've been very quiet on this. British unionism has become very muscular, and I mean that, in a very right-wing way over the last few years. And it seems like a lot of these voices that you would expect to kind of say something about this, because we're not stuck for right-wing commentators in our newspapers, have been very silent.
Well, I mean, Hardeep has written about this, and we actually went to both Dublin and Belfast and look, and what is described as, from both in Belfast and Dublin, moderate unionists, that this is English nationalism resurgent. But Hardeep, I just wonder if you want to talk to Peter at all about this?
About?
The English, and what's going on in...
Yeah, I mean, hello, Peter. I'm coming in at the end. Hello. I mean, it's a curious notion that in many ways the Brexit vote was described as a case of, English nationalism and England rising up to have its voice heard. But as other sort of commentators have pointed out, like John Denham, Boris Johnson doesn't seem to really care that much about meeting England's needs. It's more of this concept of trying to keep Great Britain together and pushing for this kind of Empire 2.0 sovereignty version post-Brexit of what this country apparently once was.
Yeah, and I think there's a very, as I'm going to rob Robert Saunders, who's I think is fantastic at being Mary, and I was talking about this today, and he said something along the lines to me that, like, it's a bit like for a lot of these unionists, it's a bit like, the union is something like a piano. It's something you like to own. It gives you pleasure. You don't want someone to take away from you, but it's not a real breathing thing. It's not something that you have an actual relationship with. And I think that's it. It kind of treats this thing as the union as a thing that has to be, either saved or celebrated. But there's rarely any sense in which the union is a living, breathing organism. And I must confess, I've not read it yet, but I'm very much looking forward to reading Michael Keating's new book on the union, which looks fantastic. He's a professor in Edinburgh and Aberdeen. And he makes a very persuasive argument that unionism for a long time was a very heterogeneous thing. It meant very different things here in Glasgow than it even did in Edinburgh, never mind between Leeds, Bradford and London, and Belfast and Derry. But that, I think, has been replaced by this, it's actually almost like a very 1890s version of unionism, which really didn't go down very well in the end. Bonar Law's projects from the 1890s kind of bore fruit in the 1910s in a very, very disastrous way.
Well, look, we must get you down to London and be the centre of, not the centre of everything at all, a different country from the rest of England sometimes it seems, to talk about these in person. But thanks so much for joining us, Peter, and keep up with your brilliant work.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, conflicts of interest seem to be swirling around everywhere in Westminster, and they're certainly at the core of the curious tale of Boris Johnson and Jennifer Arcuri. Now, this week I spoke to Double Down News about why this story still isn't receiving coverage from mainstream broadcasters. Revelations about the relationship between the American businesswoman Jennifer Arcuri and the then Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, first emerged in 2019 when questions were raised around why Hacker House, a new company established by Jennifer Arcuri, was given £100,000 by the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. Other behaviour that we must question is why Boris Johnson spoke for free at 4 tech events organised by Jennifer Arcuri.
Thank you very much, Jennifer.
Thank you for coming and hanging out with us.
My pleasure.
Jennifer Arcuri was able to go on trade missions organised by the London Mayor's office, even though she didn't meet the criteria for such trips. Was there a conflict of interest?
You like hanging out with us, right?
I do. I'm always happy to hang out at Inotech.
Fast forward to the last few weeks, and in an extensive interview with the Daily Mirror, Jennifer Arcuri has now confirmed that she was in a 4-year-long sexual affair with Boris Johnson while he was married and while he was Mayor of London.
If you are having an affair with someone and you pay them £126,000 of public money, that becomes very, very reprehensible. And if you put them on trade missions and also write letters suggesting that they get jobs which they're not qualified for, again, the fact you're having an affair with them is important.
We've seen a pattern emerging of close associates of the Conservative Party, of donors benefiting from millions of pounds in public contracts. This is public money. Surely it is in the public interest to know whether Jennifer Arcuri benefited from her status as having a sexual relationship with Boris Johnson. One of the really curious aspects was the lack of coverage of these new claims by the BBC. Now, at that stage, the last time that the BBC News had reported on the Arcuri affair was last May, under a headline that Boris Johnson will not have to face any criminal inquiry. I approached the BBC News' press office and asked where the coverage was. Surely this was a matter of public interest. The response back from the BBC was that stories are always considered due to their editorial merit, and that the story of Arcuri and her affair with Boris Johnson has been covered substantially when there have been newsworthy updates. Byline Times writer Patrick Howes, who's a former BBC producer and journalist, talked to his former colleagues in light of these comments about newsworthiness and editorial merit. According to his former colleagues, this was coming from the top, a fear of casting Boris Johnson in a bad light, and this notion of appeasing people who don't seem to like the BBC very much. In January, Byline Times also reported that the new chairman of the BBC, Richard Sharp, has donated more than £400,000 to the Conservative Party. The new Director General of the BBC, Tim Davies, also stood as a Conservative Party councillor during a political career. Has the BBC been captured? I don't ask these questions because I want to bash the BBC. I've always loved the BBC. It has always been the channel through which huge swathes of the British public find out about what's going on in its country. Fundamentally, it's a question of public trust. Curiously, after my question to the BBC about why the new claims by Arcuri hadn't received any coverage, a story did appear, and it was about how the Conservative Party provided financial support to the now Prime Minister when claims of a relationship between him and Arcuri first surfaced, and the Independent Office for Police Conduct were looking into whether a criminal inquiry was necessary. Being a journalist during the time of Boris Johnson as British Prime Minister has been eye-opening, to be honest, because of the sheer lack of accountability that this government wants to open itself up to. It just begs the question, what next? If Johnson acts with impunity and knows that he won't be held to account, either by the opposition, the media, where does this sort of behaviour end? He goes from scandal to scandal, becoming more and more untouchable, it seems. Impunity reigns, and this in itself decays the fabric of British democracy. And it's up to all of us to care about this and ask. It may just seem like a story of an affair with Jennifer Arcuri, which didn't receive that much public interest, but it's so much bigger than that. And if Boris Johnson feels very confident that he has no case to answer for and acts with integrity and honesty with regards to Arcuri and her claims, then what else will he use that argument for? What else will he feel empowered to hide from us? So the Jennifer Arcuri scandal is just another example of how this is a systemic issue. And with Boris Johnson announcing an inquiry into David Cameron, the former Prime Minister, and his lobbying on behalf of Greensill Capital, we shouldn't forget that in many ways this is a colossal act of projection and deflection by putting the accusation of notions of conflicts of interest and cronyism centre table. Johnson can cleverly claim, well, you know, there's no problems here, we're being transparent, we're looking into it. But this is a structural issue. This is about the culture of the Conservative Party, and we need to keep pressing, I would say, the mainstream media, the independent media, the opposition politicians, to reveal some of these wider problems which have been all too pervasive during a public health crisis in which 150,000 people have died on the watch of the current Prime Minister.
In order to see how we might be able to do that and push for a public inquiry into these many wrongs, I want to introduce Professor Brian Cathcart, who can help us out here a little bit. Why? Because 10 years ago, there was quite a big scandal brewing which the British press wouldn't cover, which required the foreign press, the New York Times, to come in and cover, which involved a serving Prime Minister and some of his press advisors, and was very difficult to get out. But you formed an organisation called Hacked Off, and within a few weeks, when the scandal broke, and that was the phone hacking scandal, and let us not forget the bribing public officials scandal associated around the Murdoch press. Within this Millie Dowler story breaking, the murder victim, her phone had been hacked, and that's still the case. You got the Leveson inquiry, and that never went to part two. It was quite an extraordinary moment in British public life that a public inquiry shone a spotlight into what really goes on in the corridors of power. Can you explain, Brian, how you managed to pull that off?
Well, I'd have to say, first of all, that it wasn't just hacked off, and that an absolutely essential role was played by Nick Davies of The Guardian in exposing particularly the hacking of Millie Dowler's phone. Now, why that mattered was because the press did not want to cover this. Something had to happen that triggered as it were, public outrage that could not be restrained, as it were, by the press ignoring it. And believe me, they tried. On the day after the hacking of Millie Dowler's phone, this was an appalling outrage. The day after that was exposed, the tabloid press shunted it inside the paper.
Yeah.
It was leading all the news bulletins. It was, everybody was talking about it, but they didn't want public, they didn't want to give leverage to the story. So that instant projected it, lifted it into a state of public outrage that the government could not ignore.
Nick Davies says in his book, Hack Attack, that actually even News International, as it was then, now News UK, executives and lawyers were gaming how do we stop it going mainstream? I think Millie Dowler, I think the McCann story, there was another story that even before it went mainstream, they're worried would explode, because maybe it's so egregious and so horrific that you couldn't contain it.
Well, we've seen how they can artfully distract, they can bury, they can subvert big stories to prevent the build-up of public, to prevent any clarity which will permit the public to form a clear view. And so that was very helpful in that sense. I mean, it's an appalling outrage, but the fact that there was focus at one moment pushed the government back. And I think the key thing about the setting up of the Leveson inquiry was that it was done on a cross-party basis. That the Cameron government, which was at that stage a coalition, didn't have the power to prevent a public inquiry because the Liberal Democrats, who were their partners, wanted one.
Right.
So it became a three-party agreement. And that, I think, is a tremendous model because it was a three-party agreement, a cross-party agreement, that there would be an inquiry, who would chair it, and what its remit was, it became something that was credible. And one thing we know about the Leveson inquiry is that despite everything that the press threw at it over the years and is still throwing at it now, the public believes in it and believed in it then. So that was a kind of key element in the package of the Leveson inquiry. Another key element was, and this was one with which we at Hacked Off were associated, was the engagement of victims. It's an interesting thing. People always say there have been, 7 inquiries into the press in 70 years or something like that. The Leveson inquiry was the first to engage with victims, the very first to try to hear the voice of people who'd been abused by the press.
What was the precedent for that? Was that something like Hillsborough, because there was a ongoing panel inquiry, which wasn't a public inquiry? Was that an innovation, or just because there were so many victims and identifiable harm?
I think it was a kind of a zeitgeist thing. I think it becomes impossible. There was a world in which only lawyers, newspaper proprietors, and MPs had the right to make decisions, and we've come a long way from there. And I think now it would be unacceptable. And I think there's a big lesson for us there, is that while it seems that now everybody says there's going to be an inquiry into the handling of the COVID crisis. Well, there are inquiries and inquiries, as we see with this Greensill thing. It's possible to fix inquiries all sorts of ways. I can certainly develop that. But one thing that is key is that for it to have credibility, the victims, in the broadest sense, those involved, have to believe in it. And I think they can withdraw their consent. So if you get a situation where the government says, yes, okay, finally, we're going to let you have a public inquiry, and what we're going to do is we're going to put this person in charge of it, Chris Grayling or something like that, and we're going to put these people on the panel, just like the commission into race, handpicked, and we're going to give it a remit, which is basically look over there, don't focus on anything that's sensitive, and that's your inquiry, like it or lump it. We don't have to accept that. It's not just that the other parties in Parliament will object; they can object. we all see what happens with that. We live in a country where they just get voted down and ignored. If the people who count in this, who are the public in a general sense, the people involved in the NHS, the bereaved, and the people suffering from long COVID, and the organisations, their organisations, but them as individuals, if they do not accept the inquiry, if they, for example, were to say, no, we're not going to participate, we're not going to give evidence, this is not a credible inquiry, go away and think again, I think that would make a substantial difference. I think there is a kind of victim power that can be asserted now to get a decent inquiry. But, I mean, one of the things to beware of is delay.
Because that's happened very quickly. Millie Dowler exploded,
Yeah.
which was going on for 2 years, the investigations and revelations, exploded in July 4th, I think.
July 4th, yeah.
2011, so we're heading for the... And then the Leveson inquiry was set up within week, and started that...
week.
Yeah.
I mean, the inquiry was promised within a week.
Wow.
And I remember, you know, the political parties were consulting Hacked Off in its capacity as representing victims about the terms of reference, you know, but very, very quickly. And I think we have to see something like that again. We have to see people who represent, you know, not just, you know, the top administrators of the NHS, but the nurses and the doctors and the porters and every trade union that's involved.
Does that also require, so you have sort of government and you have, as you describe it, the interested parties, people who we would think would be putting pressure for a full, robust, independent inquiry. And I guess what would you say is the main obstacle, Brian? I mean, in the middle of this, presumably you have the media, which, again, when you're talking at the start about the Millie Dowler case, it reached such a critical point because, to some extent, it was sort of, you know, the tabloids did, but the other papers couldn't avoid it, and it was going more and more up the agenda. What do you see as the main obstacle? That even if there were all these people saying we need a robust inquiry into COVID, why might that still not happen?
I think that the chief risk is delay. So there have been moments where the public anger has been palpable. The government knows that with the NHS vaccine rollout, which is pretty successful, that things are fading into the past. There's a thing where doctors talk about how, you know, patients don't worry after the event much about the pain they went through if the final element of it was they were cured.
Yeah.
Well, you know, people a lot of people will forget. A lot of people won't, but a lot of people will forget, and the pressure will ease on the government, and that will give them more latitude to fix what the kind of inquiry there is, ultimately. I think that what we need is the kind of we need to keep a focus on the need to learn lessons and the need for accountability. I think that those two are essential, and that, you know, there have been plenty of moments when people have been asked, do you think there should be a public inquiry? And, you know, there's overwhelming support for the idea. I think there still would be, but we need to, you know, to put the pressure on sooner rather than later.
And if the media lets this fade and isn't the channel through which that pressure is communicated, then that's a big problem.
It is a big problem, and that's essentially the parallel with the Leveson. I mean, if they could have done anything, you know, more to prevent it, they would have. What had to happen was that the state of public demand rose above it, and also, I think in that case, there was such a shocking story, that the broadcast media could not ignore it. As we know, the broadcast media, it likes to follow, most of it, likes to follow the print media agenda. That's just the way they're made. They rarely break away from that, but this was an instance where basically they did. I think they probably had no choice.
But mitigating in a way against, you know, that public feeling is quite easy. It was easier, and sometimes to the point of demonisation, to see who are the goodies and baddies in phone hacking, and obviously, it's more difficult to say incompetence. Misfeasance is much more difficult to get angry about than malfeasance. Like, say, Boris Johnson might have been incompetent, or the system. But surely, isn't there also a pressure point? Is this could happen again? I mean, the virus might mutate anyway, but there probably will be another pandemic at some point, and we have to fix it for the future.
Well, we'd be idiots if we thought this was the last pandemic. I mean, it would be, so lessons do have to be learned. But again, there would be I can see in my mind's eye government ministers framing arguments about, we mustn't let this be personalised. We mustn't look backwards. We need to look forwards.
Yes,
It'll be learning lessons without actually looking at what happened.
Yes.
That's the kind of rhetoric to expect. But at the same time, if we're vigilant, and if particularly the people who feel the most demand for it, as I say, the broadly defined, the participants and victims in it, so the people in all aspects of the health service, but also the care service, and I mean all the people who worked through the worst of it and exposed themselves to infection, all of those people, the families of those who died, and so on. If you have sufficient strength of feeling from them, that's a key starting point. But I think they need to recognise their power, and I do think they need to be prepared to say no, because look at it the other way. We know what this government is like. So the Greensill inquiry isn't going to be anything of the kind. I've seen, other inquiries come and go of various kinds. I remember I reported on the Deep Cut review, 2006, and this was a behind closed doors review of a scandal in which 4 young people died at military barracks. I can tell you that the families of those 4 young people who agreed to this review somewhat reluctantly, put to them by the Labour government at the time, they agreed reluctantly to it. They regretted it bitterly because it all happened behind closed doors. They had no control. People were dealt with on a basis that no public inquiry. Now, transform that. Here was essentially the chair of the inquiry who would go and meet people, get on first name terms with them, who were basically suspects in the case. It was not appropriate, and it was not adversarial enough. It was too accommodating. That's the establishment rubbing shoulders with each other. Contrast that with what we saw at the Leveson inquiry, which I think was groundbreaking, not least because it was the first to be broadcast.
But also the book you wrote about, and 20 years ago, what happened with the Macpherson report.
Yeah, well, that was an interesting case, and that was a very good case, very good instance of the power of the central characters. The Lawrences demanded an inquiry, which Jack Straw actually, of a kind, Jack Straw didn't want to give it. He wanted something general. He didn't want something that focused on what had happened to their son. And Doreen Lawrence insisted she had the power, because if she had said, okay, you can have that inquiry, but we're having nothing to do with it, and it's not going to teach you anything about the death of my son. If she had said that, she'd have killed it. That would have been it. So she got an inquiry in the area she wanted. She didn't get the judge she wanted, but it was really interesting that the Lawrences complained that Macpherson was too much of an establishment figure before the inquiry began. But in fact, of course, that turned to advantage, because this extremely establishment figure, I mean, you'd search the country for somebody more establishment, turned out to be absolutely outraged by everything he heard and furious about it. And his report was, a tremendous landmark. Of course, with inquiries, you can say the Leveson inquiry, the Macpherson inquiry didn't change the world. They certainly didn't. You do need governments to act on these things properly. But what they do that's interesting and important is they set benchmarks. So With Macpherson, we're still referring to Macpherson all the time.
And institutional racism.
And institutional racism. And lots of other things. And in the police service, I can tell you, there's, they're haunted by it. In the Leveson case, it is the benchmark for what should be done. And only yesterday, an all-party parliamentary group was basically throwing the issue of discrimination in the press, religious discrimination in the press, back to the Leveson, saying to the government, you've got to look at this again. Now, so, we may not get from this kind of government the kinds of things we want out of a public inquiry, but what we get is what, usually, often, if it's the right kind of operation, a shrewd judgment of what we need to do.
There's a couple of curious cases recently, not in terms of inquiries, but these sort of government commissioned reviews. Obviously, I think you wrote for us, Brian, a piece with regards to the race report that came out recently. But within that, Brian mentioned these extraordinary 2 examples, very recent. One involving the Home Secretary Priti Patel's department and so-called grooming gangs. Another involving judicial review.
Yeah.
And in both cases, this notion that when the government didn't get what they wanted from these apparently independent commissions, I mean, they're trying to just rewrite it. I mean, it was just that these 2 examples.
Keep asking the question until they get the answer they want. One example was to do with judicial review. So the government set up an independent panel, hand-picked, not independent at all, into the functioning of judicial review, because that's one of the ways, we should be very aware of this, that is one of the ways in which they want to constrict their own accountability.
Yes, people can take the government to account, to
and we
court
see
over their
what
decisions.
the Good Law Project and what others are doing, Open Democracy have been doing, in terms of the using judicial review to get change in relation to Brexit. It's really important decisions. So they want to neuter judicial review. It's quite clear. They set up this hand-picked panel. The hand-picked panel hums and haws for 6 months and comes back and says, well, actually, we don't see judicial review being abused that much. There doesn't seem to be a problem. To which the government says, well, we're going to conduct a consultation on this issue. And they issue consultation documents which say, we had this review and it said there's a problem. It didn't say there was a problem. But they're going back, because they didn't get the answer they wanted from that, they're going to have another process. They'll fix that, because consultations are easy to fix. And then they will go to Parliament and try and change the law. And I think that's a pattern, Priti Patel, grooming gangs. A big contrast between the Commission report on race, which was a fly-by-night operation and was not peer-reviewed, which is why experts of every kind have come out of the wings to say this is rubbish, or my research has been abused, or I never said that, or whatever. The government's, the Home Office's internal study of the issue of Asian grooming gangs and the was this, as it were, something to which Asian men are particularly prone, found that there was no grounds to make that assumption, explicitly to the Home Secretary's disappointment. So what does she do? She says, well, we're going to go and have to find the data. But the big difference was that was thoroughly peer-reviewed, circulated among people who really knew what they were talking about.
And she put this in the foreword of the actual report.
Yeah,
she said these findings are disappointing. It's just
the facts disappoint me. The facts disappoint me. I'm going to set up another body to look for different facts for me. It is, as one of the experts in the field said, the difference between looking for the difference between having evidence-led policy, which is what we want, and policy-led evidence, which is what Priti Patel wants, and what the government tends to trade on.
Well, we should definitely come back very soon and revisit this in July, and maybe we'll talk about soon another report that's due to land soon, which is the Daniel Morgan Independent Panel, which, for people who don't know, involves News of the World, tabloid media, police corruption and a tragic murder. But Brian, thank you so much for coming in and hopefully giving some pointers about where we could go.
Yeah, and some tactics to look out for, it seems. Yeah, thank you so much, Brian. Well, it's been quite a show, hasn't it? Talking about corruption. Are we a corrupted state? Certainly, there are serious questions we all need to ask ourselves. And tonight, we'll leave you with this clip. Good night.
We have cut CO2 emissions in this country since 2010 on 1990 levels by 42%. 42%. That is an astonishing achievement.
Well, it would be if it were true, but it's just another lie. CO2 emissions fell by 39% between 1990 and 2018, not from 2010 onwards.
The economy under this Conservative government has grown by 73%.
Another lie. In the period since 2010 and prior to the pandemic, it was about 20%. The 73% he's referring to is for the whole period since 1990, 13 years of which was under Labour governments.
We've restored the nurses' bursary.
Another lie. A maintenance grant for student nurses is not a return of the student nurses' bursary. Thanks to the Conservative government scrapping the nurses' bursary, they still have to pay extortionate tuition fees and still qualify tens of thousands of pounds in debt.
And ensure there will be a free hospital car parking for everybody who attends a hospital.
Just another lie.
Absolute poverty, relative poverty have both declined under this government, and there are hundreds of thousands, I think 400,000 fewer families living in poverty now than there were in 2010.
More lies. The number of people in relative poverty in the UK has increased from 13.6 million in 2010 to 14.5 million in 2019. And as for his claim that 400,000 fewer families are living in poverty, well, it appears he just made that up.
The app would be the icing on the cake. If we can get it to work, it would be a fine thing, but there isn't one anywhere in the world so far.
Another lie. At the time, track and trace apps were being used in France, Germany, Australia, Poland, Latvia, Denmark, Japan, Italy.
He will know that the government is engaged in record investments in the NHS, £34 billion.
Another lie. In real terms, it's a spending increase of just £20.5 billion. The Institute for Fiscal Studies points out that's less than funding used to rise under Labour.
We've absolutely determined to support childcare.
You've just increased child benefit by 35 pence a week.